And I welcome you to what would be a Brown University panel, would it not be for Peter Jacques, the professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Central Florida. I best know Peter's work with Riley Dunlap on climate change denial, books and conservative think tanks, which were really a classic in opening, getting the clarity about the sort of like distribution of denial literature time back. Peter is talking about the DNA, geography, and base of climate denial first, but then we have the Brown teams of Timmons Roberts, Galen Hall and Trevor Culhane, and Carter Werthman and Robert Brulle. And they, of course, also very well known to scholars in the field for having done some of the most important work on the climate denial opposition forces in the United States. And Timmons, of course, also on climate finance, climate justice in the global south. So I'm very much looking forward to this panel, and Peter has first the word. We have 20 minutes each, and I think we will go back to back and then have the left time of the panel for Q&A afterwards. Thank you for being here. Peter, it's your floor.
Okay, thank you. Am I able to share my screen?
Yes, you can now.
Okay, now. Okay, great. Thanks. Okay. Yeah, hey, thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here, especially with some of my most esteemed colleagues here. I'm Peter Hackes for the Politics of School at the University of Central Florida. And this work what I'm going to show you is going to be based off of two different projects. One, an extremely long, this took so long. This is a deep reading and coding of all the books that we had described in a 2013 article that attempted to collect all the English language books that rejected climate science. This is a project with Riley. And then I'm also going to explain a comparative geography of climate change, of the counter movement, and that is going to be based off of a chapter that's coming out soon. So the first project, maybe the connected second project as well, is really trying to get at, okay, we have a good sense of what the claims are, Dr. Brulle's work on the climate machinery and his digging deep into the IRS, filings was really important to me. And the tactics, many people have commented on the, and described the tactics, but what is the root, of climate denial? Part of this is assuming that we understand it's not about the science, right? So that's already been explained here. So if it's not about the science, then what is it really, really about? And we've had a couple different things put out there this morning already on some ideas. And so I'm going to kind of explain some of my ideas about what we think this could be about. So we have, in this 2013 piece, we described 108 books. Now, this is limited to 2010. The first book is in 1982, goes to 2010. And we had to stop there because there's just so much to do if you're going to do a deep reading of that many books. And so our process was, to try and first make sure that these books were in fact rejecting climate science based off of the kind of three major categories. And then we also tracked opposition to climate policies, because we know that's important. But that's not how we don't define climate denial that way. We only define it through these three categories. And you can see that really they all most of the books kind of make these different kinds of, they can make all the claims really, but the heaviest kind of agreement is on the cause, and then let's not do anything about it. That's not surprising. But what we did was trying to not only latch on to figure out what's happening in the actual texts of long form kind of articulation in a so book length kind of narrative is, so first, as I mentioned here, deductively identify the climate denial based off of our literature. But then the more important thing, the meat of this work, is to do what we say, code the semantic ecosystem. And this is something we are proposing as a way to understand the larger kind of narratives around the actual climate denial claims. So this is difficult. So the process looked kind of like this, where we identified the climate denial claims through positive coding, which is just kind of plain language of a rejection of some of those three forms of climate science. And so here is an example of one of the book passages where number 1 was the first positive code based off of rejection of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is consistently reported as a pollutant, and all everyone who breathes is then polluting and dubbed toxic, and then kind of really undermines or challenges the idea of CO2 is causing global warming. So that's our positive code there, and then we look to the surrounding kind of semantic ecosystem, as we're describing it, to link up to the narratives around this claim here, to try and get at what we hope would be some sort of more core rationale. So the second code is the more important one down here under the first page on the subheading "Lies, Damned Lies" in the BBC climate reports. And so we do this for all of the books. Now, notably, we cannot do much more than identify, how many books say that there's, a problem with, the cause of climate change or the impact, because once we found those codes, we stopped in order to reduce the data. So this isn't, we can't do a quantification of how many times is, the cause of climate change rejected, merely how many books do that. And then once we found that, we stopped that coding process. Of course, we had, there's lots of narrative to go through, and this is just an example of the policy opposition rationale. Some of this gets to some of the things we just heard from Dr. Forschner. Sorry, I'm probably butchering the name. And these will actually connect to some of the deeper rationale. Mitigating, climate change will kill people, be used to create a world government by controlling energy. Of course, reducing greenhouse gases won't have any effect on climate if greenhouse gases aren't causing climate change. No alternatives, harm the power of the United States. Even, arrest Western progress will be too costly. We heard that one before. Will actually increase environmental problems and create war. And I can kind of relate some of the actual text if we have some time here, but that's just an example of that. Some of that stuff we have already known as part of the claims, and this is getting into two of the things that we're kind of dividing the core rationale, what we're calling the DNA of climate denial in these books. And the first one is consistent with Busalis and Cohn's work and global environmental change, that climate science is not to be trusted, right? It's corrupt. It's used as a political tool. It's used to fearmonger. So there's suspicions of a real climate, conspiracy. There's a sense that climate scientists lie. They're getting paid off. I always find that one kind of funny, because that indicates that no one really understands how grants work. But it's propaganda, and it's outright deception. So these books are making the claim that, and attacking the integrity of science itself, and in particular climate science, which is going to be important in a minute here. There's a fear that articulating a consensus is really a political tool to prematurely close debate, and obviously contrarians feel vilified, and that they themselves are precluded from the benefits of their, some of these are real climate scientists, and some of them are professional academics. For example, one person who's passed away was a real physicist in Georgia, and he spent half of his book arguing that it was impossible for climate to warm, and the other half of his book that we needed more radiation for our health. So there are obviously real academics in these books, and they're saying, look, our opportunities are being stalled because of the positions we're taking, even though they're true. Sense that there's a lobby mechanism for already decided policies, and all of this is from the complicity or outright manipulation from science itself. So attacking the integrity of science is what we're identifying as one of the key components of these books. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise, really, but what hasn't really been articulated in terms of the claims of climate denial in the literature as much is really just an outright anti-environmentalism. In a 2009 book, I described the counter movement as being an innovation for anti-environmentalism because it says it's not really anti-environmental, it's just making epistemic challenges, which was different than other anti-environmental movements in the United States before then, which were just outright against environmentalism, against environmental protections and environmental policies. Whereas the counter movement said, no, what we're really saying is the problem is in the knowledge base, right? So that that's where the problem is. Well, in the kind of ecosystem of semantics here, we identify overt anti-environmentalism as a key strand of the rationale of climate denial and the counter movement. Some of these are going to be very familiar to you, right? So anti-capitalist, enemy of freedom, will lead to actual tragedy. Environmentalism itself is related to fascism. It's anti-civilization, anti-human. Environmentalism itself is genocidal, anti-Christian, etc. And what this gets down to is a pretty tight fit with anti-reflexivity, which was a concept that was kind of fleshed out by McWright and Dunlap. I think 2010 was the first article that they kind of explained this proposition. But what we found in the books just kind of emerged that in a way that fit with this anti-reflexivity, which is a opposition to reflexive modernity and impact science. And the reflexive modernity here would be something like the global environmental movement. And then impact science would be something like climate change, as opposed to, say, engineering, which would be a productive, production-based science, right? And so, and ironically, as a side note, that this indicates that the dominant social paradigm that we've kind of discussed in environmental politics for a long time, that includes the faith in science, efficacy in science and technology, really should be the faith in some science. And so, in this way, it appears that the DNA, the purpose of denial is to articulate these things, this anti-reflexivity, as a way to protect the law from the loss of hegemonic power and economic privilege, and the geography will help bolster this as well. Also, if you could give me a note when I have 5 minutes left. I forgot to set my clock. And so I really think that, and I've had a suspicion of this for a long time, that climate denial and the counter movement is really, comes from this deep anxiety and fear of that the implications of climate change will change things for people who are privileged, in particular, Western civilization, Western power, US power in particular, neoliberal capitalism, that these kinds of things, if we take them seriously, they're going to, put the head of this political structure in the guillotine. And I think that the books seem to articulate this as well. When we map this out, so this is in a handbook that's coming out soon, edited by Stacy Vanderveer, Erica Weinthal, and Jeannie Sowers. This is kind of looking to where are these organizations, and first I'll map out the books, but it looks like that the Anglo country group, so those of you not familiar, in comparative politics, we'd identify an Anglo grouping, which is English-speaking Protestant, mainly Protestant, former British colonies with institutionalized white power. Some of these might be a little bit of a surprise to you, but this is the classic grouping of Anglo countries: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, UK, and the US. But inside this group, of course, they don't, there's a difference in them, and as well as between them, between other countries. But Anglo countries seem to have the lion's share and explain the organization of climate denial in the counter movement. So in Riley and I's first, thank you. Okay. First book here, almost all the books that were challenging environmental problems were Anglo, minus Sweden, Germany, and France, with one book piece coming from them. In the 2013 books that we just talked about, we're looking at still a little bit more diffusion, but still mainly Anglo countries in terms of where the books are coming from. The books are important because they're kind of oftentimes organized by think tanks and have a kind of productive force behind them. But we're seeing broad diffusion around the world, consistent with some of the goals of this conference, and I appreciate the nuance that's being articulated here. But using Dr. McKee, who's here, forward to talking more. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to kind of break out and leave in a little bit for something else. But Dr. McKee's data from her dissertation, and she does something different than we did, is able to show beyond English language organizations. So I was, limited by my own English-speaking kind of narrow focus, but she was able to look at counter movement organizations around the world beyond English language constraints, and found that was much broader, and the articulation of denial and some of these CCM, these counter movement organizations, are really much more than what we thought. But if we put it in terms of the numbers here, we're still looking at about 80% of Anglo countries highlighted here on the right-hand column, but kind of visually you can see the US, then the UK, and the UK is even much smaller than, by a lot, than the US, and then it essentially becomes trivial after, well, I guess if you go to those with at least 3, starting with Austria, and so the organization of this movement is really Anglo, and oftentimes she found that those organizations that were international had material ties to the other Anglo think tanks, etc. And so this implies a defense of global hegemony on the Anglo countries' part. The British being the prior empire and world power, and then the US. And also, this is racial, so I see this as a defense of economic and racial hegemony. And this still seems to indicate that climate denial in the organization of the counter movement has almost been a singular Anglo project. So I think together, take a look and see these things as a defense of power. It emanates from a sense of existential dread disruption of privilege, and it implicates a committed identity to that global hegemony. And ironically, it admits that there is a climate change reality that they're afraid of. Thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to show you that research.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think we are switching now quickly to Timmons, Galen, and Trevor, who will answer the question, who's delaying climate action in the United States?
Thank you, Dieter. And Peter, that was really interesting. I appreciate it very much, and it certainly gets the ideas going. We're going to present as a team. My job is to be extremely quick and to start my watch, as you just reminded me. Let's see. Okay. So, Galen will be sharing his screen, hopefully here. Let's see. Okay, so we're looking at a specific case of Massachusetts, which I'll talk about in a second, but I first want to make the case for why looking at states, that is the subnational level in the United States, is a great place to do research. There's gridlock, or even now rollback, during the Trump administration at the federal level in the US, and there's this sort of roadblock in the US Senate, which requires a supermajority with sort of a biased representation in the body to rural and smaller states, which have been traditionally resistant to climate action. The states, though, are really diverse, and they have this varying combinations of fossil dependency, political control, urbanization, vulnerability to climate change, coastal locations, and so on. There are also, committees hold hearings on legislative proposals, and that testimony is public, it's open, that it's not invited, which is quite unlike the federal level. These lobbying records are quite diverse. Some of them are extraordinary, as Galen will be taking us through in a moment. And then there's, the whole public relations ecosystem, and there's media locally, and then there's this access to leaders, the staff, legislators, agency personnel, and social movements that I think are just unrivaled at the state level. So next slide, Galen. Our case study is Massachusetts, which is on the east coast of the US. So that's the Atlantic Ocean over there, with Cape Cod as a famous, and its islands, geographic feature, which is extremely vulnerable to sea level rise. It's 7 million people. It's vulnerable to coastal erosion. It has Democratic Party supermajorities in both legislative chambers. It's been a historic leader on climate change with a huge activist community. This is a picture just of one of the coalitions called Mass Power Forward. And we use their list of legislation that they see as their priorities. But its climate action in Massachusetts was stalled largely from 2010 to 2020. And we want to know why. I mean, this was a decade when a lot was happening, but nothing substantial really made it through the legislature. Next slide. So this study, I'm just going to sort of wave my hands to some of the literature which we have in our article, which is coming out in a matter of days from Energy Research and Social Science. And the article is called "Who Delays Climate Action? Interest Groups and Coalitions in State Legislative Struggles in the US." So we think this case provides some leverage to looking at whether it's more structural factors in states or whether it's processes, how much certain window opportunities and focusing events are driving climate action and inaction. There's Josh Bassich's, who's a Climate Social Science Network working group leader of our state level group, who's did a study in Massachusetts and 2 other states for his doctoral dissertation, showing that there's these stages in the process of passing legislation, some of which are really exclusive to anybody except for the very best and most connected lobbyists, which are traditionally paid for by utilities, electric and gas utilities, and by fossil fuel industries, for example. There's a lot we can learn, again, about what goes on in the foreground in public testimony versus what happens in lobbying, that is behind closed doors, efforts to influence. And our study is different because we're sort of pioneering a new quantitative approach and not just tracing the history of particular pieces of legislation, but trying to capture the whole universe. So next slide. So we have a couple of research questions. We're looking at, what actors who supports and opposes climate and clean energy legislation, and how do the different groups interact? What do they want? What issues are they focusing on? How do they argue for their priorities? So we spent a lot of time, especially Trevor, reading through their testimony and categorizing it by the arguments that are made. And then we look and see who's the winners and losers, who's getting what they want, and how do they use the legislative process to get what they want. So I'm going to hand it over to Galen. I'm sorry, to Trevor.
So I'm going to talk about our testimony analysis, and then Galen will talk about lobbying. So every bill in Massachusetts gets a hearing. So people are able to give oral testimony in person, and they're also able to submit written testimony. And this testimony gives us a good picture of some of who the major players are, how much support or opposition there is, as well as some of the arguments being used. So for our methods, we gather lists of priority legislation from a few different environmental groups. And we use these kind of as the scope for our testimony analysis. This is from 2013 to 2018. And so for each piece of testimony we were able to receive, we looked at the positions they took. So supported or opposed a certain bill, looked at who was giving that testimony, whether they were speaking on their own behalf or on behalf of an organization. And we also looked at some of the arguments being used. So for collecting testimony, a lot of the testimony had been discarded or wasn't available to us. But from the testimony we were able to collect, we collected about 1,400 positions on about 50 environmental priority bills. So looking ahead to our results, the big picture we're seeing is that testimony in legislative committees is really strongly in support of climate action. So in green here, this is each position taken in support of one of these environmental groups on their position on the bill. And red is opposition to the environmental group's position, and then gray is neutral or an unclear position. So really strong support for climate action across different sessions, across different issues. It's pretty consistent in support. The second big thing we're seeing here, is the opposition is pretty limited to specific sectors. So we see heating oils, fossil fuels, utilities, and real estate. They're some of the top sectors that are, most of their testimony is opposing environmental groups. I'll note here that these numbers are very small. This is over a 6-year period. We know that a lot of climate legislation was stalled or delayed. So in general, we're not seeing these industries particularly engaging in this public hearing process. I'll also note in terms of the opposition, we only found one piece of testimony submitted by an individual on their own behalf that denied climate change. All of the rest of this opposition either acknowledged the existence of climate change or said that they actually supported climate action, but didn't support this or that particular policy. And then the third thing I'll note here is that in contrast to federal testimony in the US, at the state level, individuals are able to speak on their own behalf. And that's actually the majority of testimony that we collected. Most of the opposition from individuals focus on a set of wind siting bills in a particular session. But overall, we're not seeing the kind of astroturfing or organization of supposed individual opposition to policies that we see in other arenas like social media or like public relations. So Galen's going to talk next about lobbying in our analysis there.
Great, thanks, Trevor. So just to quickly recap sort of where we are right now in the analysis of what's slowing climate action in Massachusetts. So we've seen there's a decade where we had very slow climate action compared to both what the science requires and what other US states were pursuing. And this is in a state with none of the common structural barriers to climate action, like in-state fossil fuel production. And as Trevor just showed, we have very high public support for climate policies in testimony. So now we're going to turn to look at lobbying records to sort of look for answers both about why climate action was slow, who was slowing it, and then also to gain a more nuanced view of the interactions between different interest groups and their preferences over climate policy. So we're lucky in Massachusetts because the state maintains really high quality lobbying records. They're sort of hard to access. We put a lot of work into just scraping this data set together and cleaning it, but once you have them, they tell you a lot. So Massachusetts lobbying records tell you who pays for lobbying. So this is an example, the utility company Eversource, which firm they hire to lobby on their behalf, who that firm actually pays to do the lobbying, and then the positions that lobbyist records on all the bills they lobby on for each client. So in our sample, we picked 314 bills over the time period 2013 to 2018, trying to find every single bill relevant to climate and energy policy in the state. And then we just record who lobbied on those bills, what position they recorded, and for which client. Then we collect some metadata on each bill from the service legiscan that gives you the votes, the committees the bill is in, the sponsor, the legislators who sponsor it, and the outcome. So I'll take us through some findings starting from high level and getting more detailed from this lobbying data set. So the highest level finding is just that clean energy advocates are vastly outspent by the opposition. So one way to look at this is just to look at the interest groups who record the most support for clean energy policies and compare their lobbying budgets to the interest groups who record the most opposition. What these bar graphs show is the total amount that each interest group spent over the time period we studied on lobbying. We're not able to disaggregate by like lobbying on particular bill, but so this is sort of more a comparison of their overall budget. And we see that almost all of the top groups, with one exception, lobbying for climate action, are nonprofits with very small lobbying budgets. They're actually restrained by law to have small lobbying budgets. In comparison, the top groups opposing climate bills are a mix of utilities like National Grid and Eversource, and other kinds of industry interest groups with very high lobbying budgets. And if you compare them, including this sort of outlier among the advocates here, the ratio is more than 3.5 to 1 in favor of the opposition. But we're going to move on and try to dig more into the particular preferences of different actors supporting and opposing climate policies. The way we do this in our study is that we look at first a sort of preference network, which links interest groups like the Environmental League of Massachusetts here or National Grid to bills, which are shown as black dots. And the color of the lines here indicates what position each interest group lobbied on each bill. So our goal is to basically define a network of actors linked by whether or not their preferences overlap or conflict with each other. And from that, we can map tensions or alliances between different interest groups in Massachusetts. So the way we do this—
Galen, you have 5 minutes, just to let you know.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. I'll speed up. So the way we do this is that we basically collapse this network to eliminate the bills and just look at dyadic relationships between interest groups. So we look at agreements and disagreements between those groups. And here's what that looks like. So edges in this network show agreements and disagreements between pairs of interest groups. The interest groups are clustered into coalitions defined by an algorithm called InfoMap, which we can talk about in questions. But the important finding here is that there are sort of 5 clusters of interest groups in Massachusetts out of 160 groups total. There are 5 clusters who tend to support each other and support bills for climate action. And then there are 4 clusters of interest groups that tend to oppose bills for climate action. And we've named these groups based on the industries of the sort of central actors in each group, which are pretty consistent throughout. So this is another way of looking at the same graph where the clusters are grouped together into large circles. So we can sort of define a green coalition of interest groups centered on a set of nonprofits and advocacy organizations like the Environmental League of Massachusetts, Clean Water Action Conservation Law Foundation. And we can define an anti-green coalition comprised of utilities, fossil and chemical companies, power generation companies, and real estate. So I'm going to start to go really fast here so I can keep within time. So the next thing we want to investigate is, what does that anti-green coalition want, right? So what are they lobbying for? Are the preferences consistent in that they always oppose climate bills, or is there some more nuance there? So the way we do this is we construct the same kind of network I just showed, but we look we use only the bills in a particular issue area to construct those dyadic relationships between interest groups. So if we're looking at lobbying on hydro and wind power bills, we find a interesting relation where utilities who are, if you remember, are on the opposition side generally, actually support hydro and wind power bills. And that places them in alliance with hydro and wind companies and these social green nonprofit organizations, and in opposition to fossil fuel power generation companies. Conversely, on solar power bills, utilities lobby strongly against them, which places them now in opposition to solar and social green organizations. And again, fossil power generation companies lobby against them. I'm going to skip this slide because it's too complicated, but this is just to show that we can do the same kind of analysis for lots of different issue areas based on our set of bills. And now I'll hand it over to Trevor just to quickly run through some other findings.
Yeah, so I'm just going to share some quotes here from 3 of the major opposition coalitions that we found. So first we see utilities, as Galen said, are opposing large-scale hydro and wind, or supporting large-scale hydro and wind, but are attacking solar. So we see here in this quote, we can do the same for the environment, but at a fraction of the cost with more wind and solar. This is pretty typical of the utilities, using generally neutral sounding arguments and comparing costs and markets. In contrast, the fossil fuel industry almost never supported any of the bills we looked at on climate and clean energy, and they're much more aggressive in their tone, much more defensive. Here they're saying, right, if fossil fuel use were to end tomorrow, the economic consequences would be catastrophic. This is from the American Petroleum Institute, right? So much more aggressive tone, much bolder arguments. And then last one I'll talk about is the real estate industry. They were very narrowly focused on building energy efficiency laws, and they use a kind of social justice sounding argument here to talk about the widening of the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And this is pretty typical of the real estate industry.
Great, thanks, Trevor. So quickly before we end, I want to touch on the last major finding, which is we wanted to ask, now that we have a better sense of the conflicting and aligning interests of the different groups in Massachusetts, who actually gets what they want in the legislature? We can't actually answer that sort of causally, but we can just look who is more successful in that their preferred bills tend to pass and their opposed bills tend to fail. The way we do this is just a logistic regression of the sort of summed lobbying for and against on each bill by each coalition, against the independent variable being whether that bill moved forward from the position it was lobbied on. So if it's in committee then and a bunch of people lobby against it, does it move forward to the next committee or does it die? And what we find is a pretty strong signal that the utilities get what they want out of the legislature more frequently than any other set of interest groups. There are only 2 other interest groups who have even a significant positive signal at all from their lobbying, and those are conservation and planning and fossil and chemical groups. What this looks like in practice is that if you look at a flow of bills through the legislature from introduction to lower level committees, higher level committees, floor votes, and passage, then I'll just kind of ignore those arrows for now. But if you just look at the utilities lobbying positions on those bills at each stage, which is what these colors show, then at the very beginning of the legislative process, utilities tend to oppose the majority of bills. That's this thick red band here. But by the end of the legislative process, nearly all the bills that make it to a floor vote and ultimately to passage are supported by the utilities coalition. There is only one exception in our entire data set. So this is just kind of a picture of what legislative success looks like, right? At each stage, the bills that utilities oppose tend to die, and the bills that they support tend to make it to the next committee. Okay, I'm not sure if we have time to recap, but I'll hand it over to Trevor just to rush through.
Yeah, so these are just summary slides. I think we can skip them for now, but happy to talk more about them. Just again, so our paper is forthcoming in Energy Research and Social Science. We also have our public report available at cssn.org. And yeah, thanks for your time. Looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Brown team number 1. And I think this was a great demonstration of strong asymmetries in the lobby and influence process on the state level, compared to the strong asymmetry Peter showed us on a global geographic distribution of denial. And now we're looking forward to Cordy Werthman and Bob's paper on the role of public relation firms in climate change politics. Kathy.
Great. Am I able to share my screen?
Yes, you are. Try.
Apologize, one moment. Okay, great. So thank you so much for introducing. And so today I'm here to present the role of public relations firms in climate change politics, which is a paper I worked on with Dr. Robert Brulle. So the sort of first question that we started with is this acknowledgement that public relations campaigns are really integral to climate politics. So public relations campaigns have really been used since the political battles over climate change were ignited with Dr. Hansen's testimony to Congress in 1988 that the atmosphere was already warming due to greenhouse gas emissions. And so even several years before this testimony, Mobil Oil's public affairs program was already seeking to shape the collective unconscious of the nation to orient towards their preferred policy outcomes and just generally have public support for their product. So in more recent years, we've seen different PR campaigns by actors involved in climate politics. We see the Eco Imagination campaign from General Electric. Chevron is the human energy company. British Petroleum became Beyond Petroleum in 2000. Exxon in the last couple of years has advertised that algae could be the future of biofuels in ads that have blanketed the New York Times and most cable network TV in the United States. We also see that environmental groups have turned to PR as well. The World Wildlife Fund has been running a campaign for the last 10 years called Earth Hour. And so all of these PR campaigns have become a really inescapable part of climate politics. So we turn to the research questions, and the first one that we were looking at is the extent of PR firm use in climate politics. After that, we were wondering which PR firms were most frequently involved in climate politics and in what activities do these PR firms engage. So to determine which organizational actors to include when looking at who hired PR firms, we turned to previous studies by Pooley in 2010 and Downey in 2019, as well as organizations which had lobbied on climate change bills in the following sectors: the gas and oil sector, coal, steel, and rail, renewable energy, electric utilities, and the environmental movement. And so that led us to a sample size of 214 organizations. So once we identified the organizations which had hired PR firms that we were interested in, we wanted to know which PR firms they had hired. So we turned to the O'Dwyer's directories of public relations firms for the period 1989 to 2020. We also reviewed 12 public relations awards agencies to trace which organizations had won awards for PR campaigns in that time period. And then we also turned to IRS Form 990 submissions for organizations that were required to file independent contractor information. So for example, we see here the National Association of Manufacturers in 2013 had to disclose a relationship with DCI Group and Edelman and other PR firms. And so these were all included in our sample. So if you look at this graph here, we see that the use of public relations firms has been fairly stable from 1989 to 2020, although in recent years, PR contracts with the organizations studied have become more concentrated among a select group of PR firms. So for example, Edelman, which is the largest PR firm in the world, made up nearly 3% of all PR contracts in our sample and was the leading firm for the oil and gas sector and for the for the coal, steel, and rail sector. So in recent years, more and more organizations have turned to these large firms. And so you can see as well, there has been a fairly precipitous decline among PR firm contracts for the coal, steel, and rail sector. And this is sort of tracked as the natural gas has displaced coal. So we see these graphs just sort of reemphasize that there's highly concentrated PR firm employment among a small group of client organizations, and a few of these organizations use PR firms extensively, and a few large PR firms receive most of the contracts from these organizations. So if we look at the public relations firm engagement by sector, we see that we sort of seek to still answer the question, who hires PR firms? And the environmental movement, despite being the sector with the most organizations in the sample, had the fewest PR contracts. The utility sector had a statistically higher engagement of public relations firms, and the renewable energy sector employed so few PR firms that its engagement was too small statistically to examine. So if we go to PR firm engagement by organization, now that we've talked about which sectors employ the most PR firms, this chart highlights the specific organizations which are hiring the most PR firms. So consistent with the utility sector, statistically high engagement of PR firms. General Electric hired the most PR firms, which is probably not surprising. You can see here that ExxonMobil and Mobil are separated in this because we included in our time period 10 years where they had not been merged, but if they were merged, that would make ExxonMobil one of the top employers of PR firms as well. And so you can see that there's a lot of oil and gas companies represented in this list of the top 25 firms, and that there are no renewable energy or environmental movement groups in the top 10 groups that employ PR firms. So it's very concentrated among the top 25 organizations, hired or contracted 70% of all the PR firms in the sample. So then we continue on to ask, which are the PR firms that are doing most of this work? So the leading firm is Edelman, which is probably not surprising because it's the leading firm for two sectors, and it's also the third leading firm for the utility sector. So even though the employment of PR firms is pretty concentrated, it's less concentrated than the organizations that are actually using PR, but overall you can see that the top 4 firms here represent almost 10% of all the contracts here. So the biggest firms in the country are getting the most contracts in this sort of climate politics space. So if we go to this diagram, this is the coal, steel, and rail sector and the public relations contracts by organization. So we have the leading organizations in the sector, and the leading PR firms are highlighted. So we can see that Edelman is the most commonly used one. It's right in the center here. And then it's closely followed by McNeely, Pigott & Fox, and Ketchum. So this oil and gas diagram is a little bit more, it has a lot more information than the previous slide. And so we can see a couple of things here. The oil and gas sector has been heavily using Edelman. It's in the center here. And then it has also used a couple other firms. We see Searle Associates is a big one, if you can see that over by the Western States Petroleum. And there's a lot of overlap between the different PR firms used by the leading oil and gas organizations. So if we look at this diagram for the utility sector, Edelman is not the leading group, it's Weber Shandwick, and there are a couple others that are pretty important here. We see Burson Marsteller, which pops up with the oil and gas sector, comes up here as well. And then if we look at the environmental movement, this diagram for the environmental movement, it's a lot less busy than the ones for oil and gas, coal, steel, and rail, or utilities. We can see that the overwhelming amount of PR contracts went to this one firm, Kaplan Communications, which has really made a name for itself as the environmental public relations firm. So if we sort of take a larger view of PR firms in climate politics, it's clear that several of the biggest firms in the PR industry are getting most of these contracts. So there's significant overlap in the preferred PR firms of the utility sector and the oil and gas sector. You can see with these darker lines. And so many of the PR firms that just keep popping up again and again were part of our case studies into what PR firms we're actually doing on behalf of organizations in this sample. So I'll pivot now to our last research question, which is what are these PR firms actually doing on behalf of the organizations that hire them? So how are these campaigns advancing their client's position in climate politics, especially to achieve favorable outcomes for the client with regards to climate legislation? So each of the PR firms that we profiled in our case studies employed information and influence campaigns, which are really these systematic, sequential, and multifaceted efforts to publicize information that orients political decision-making towards the client's desired outcome. So you can see here from this diagram, the key takeaway here is that these information and influence campaigns are really complex and they target multiple parts of the public and political sphere. So some of the mechanisms that we saw in these information and influence campaigns were direct engagement with the public. So for example, that's going to be the ads for ExxonMobil that promote the research into algae as biofuel. So the American public sees Exxon as a company that's moving towards cleaner energy. But there's also a use of third parties. And so this is slightly different. The extensive use of third parties to promote information favorable to the client was really used across all sectors. And one of the more interesting examples to me was Energy Citizens, which was created by Edelman for the American Petroleum Institute in 2009. And the American Petroleum Institute is the leading trade association for the oil and gas sector. So essentially this group was created and promoted as a citizens group, so made up of people that were especially interested in energy, specifically the fact that in 2009, the American Clean Energy and Security Act had passed and was heading on to the Senate as the Waxman-Markey bill. So in that period in between the bill moving to the Senate, this group began holding citizen rallies in states with vulnerable Democratic senators that were had not stated publicly which way they were going to vote on the bill. And so these rallies created the appearance that there was a lot of grassroots opposition to this bill. Later on, it was revealed that, or internal documents from the American Petroleum Institute revealed that Edelman requested oil companies to send their employees to these rallies. So instead of being a citizens group, this was really a public relations campaign that involved the client. And as the bill failed, we can see that these campaigns can be enormously influential. And so if we look more closely at public relations firms, the activities, part of this research was profiling 20 of the PR firms that consistently showed up in the research. So to do this, we did a literature search of 9 major media outlets and 3 PR trade publications. So for example, these PR trade publications reported on the sort of inner workings of the PR industry and shed a lot of light on who was working for who and the types of activities that were going on. We did a Nexus Uni search of local newspapers, a PR firm website review. And so here you can see the PR firm Story Partners is actually advertising the work that they're doing. This actually shows multiple strategies that were mentioned. it's a little unclear on this slideshow, but at the bottom of these ads, this is actually not attributed to the client, which was Noble Energy, a gas company. It was attributed to the Consumer Energy Alliance. So it's using these third parties. These are print ads, and the PR firm itself is advertising their work. And then we also reviewed the social media of the PR firms and of the organizations. And so looking closely at the strategies and tactics of PR campaigns, there is this third-party mobilization, which is essentially the energy citizens. We also see here the energy from shale. This is a group that was created by the Independent Petroleum Association. So the PR firm was FTI Consulting, so they created this group for the organization. So that's that third-party mobilization. We've got image promotion for the organization and delegitimization of opposition. And then in terms of tactics, these paid media campaigns were used in each campaign. Earned media placements were used heavily. Grassroots rallies and events were not used as much. But social media campaigns were somewhat ubiquitous. And so again, you can see from these tweets from the energy from shale that the social media space has really been an increasing part of these PR campaigns.
Corey, this is the 5-minute call.
Great. So just to sort of summarize some of the main findings, the extent of PR firms in climate politics is pretty common across all sectors, but only the utility sector exhibits a statistically higher frequency of using PR firms than others. But a few organizations have the highest level of engagement of PR firms. So in terms of which PR firms are most frequently involved in climate politics, it's, again, a few large firms garner the bulk of the work. So Edelman, Kaplan, and Weber Shandwick all exceed 2% of total contracts. So it's a highly concentrated among the leading firms in the country. And then turning to one of the more interesting questions, what activities do these PR firms engage in? They're really all engaging in these multi-activity integrated campaigns. So they include social media campaigns and paid media campaigns that can stretch across print media, cable news, cable TV. And the most frequent strategies include third-party mobilization. So instead of the ads being under the name of Exxon, they'll be under a third-party name and image promotion. And then social media campaigns and paid advertising are just completely ubiquitous in these campaigns. So sort of going into the final thoughts, I just wanted to emphasize again that the research of the role of PR firms in climate politics is in its infancy, but it's fairly clear from our research that PR firms are major organizational actors in climate politics. So there's still not a lot understood about these campaigns. And I would argue that one of the leading questions is how much are these PR contracts actually worth? While it's possible to track the sort of money that's changing hands when it comes to trade associations like the American Petroleum Institute or the National Association of Manufacturers, if you remember that little excerpt that I showed on one of the slides, it's not possible to trace it as extensively for private corporations. So it's harder to know how much Chevron spent on public relations, for example. Since there's a lot of earned media for these campaigns, it's interesting to investigate if PR firms pay scientists to basically push this misinformation, and then the specific effects of these campaigns on climate action is another lingering question. Thank you so much.